Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the Hopenning, the place where hope is happening. This is a space that my dear friend Fran and I created for you to bring you a lot of hope in a life where sometimes it feels like hope is avoiding all of us. And we are very privileged to invite phenomenal people as our guest every week. And Fran will introduce you to our guest. And this is episode 62 and the place where we talk about hope. My friend Fran and co-host is a teacher in Northern Alberta, Canada, and she is just retiring this year, right, Fran? And she's been doing this for
2 months, Marina. Let's
2
get this
months.
straight. Two and a half.
Wow, wow, what a new chapter! That's amazing. I am
Yep.
coming to you right now from the southeastern corner of British Columbia, Canada, where I am enjoying a little bit of downtime by my cabin. And I'm a full-time rapid transformational therapist. And so Fran does that part-time, not for long anymore, Fran. And will be joining me in this wonderful life of helping people. So we're very blessed to have you here with us. And Fran has the floor.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you all for tuning in today. It's going to be wonderful. We have a best-selling author here, and his name is Shane Claiborne, and I have been following him for a while. I am almost his biggest fan, other than his mom. I am his second biggest fan. Yes, Shane is a prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author. He worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta and founded the Simple Way in Philadelphia. He heads up Red Letter Christians, a movement of folks who are committed to living as if Jesus meant the things he said. He is a champion for grace, which has led him to jail, advocating for the homeless, and to places like Iraq and Afghanistan to stand against war. Now, grace fuels his passion to end the death penalty and to help stop gun violence. Shane has written, I think, his 10th book, and the last one is called Rethinking Life, which just came out in February of 2023. I listened to it. That's the one. I listened to it on audio yesterday. Well, it took me a few days, and it is incredible. It's one of the most powerful reads I've ever read. He speaks over 100 times a year, nationally and internationally. His books have been translated into a dozen languages. He has appeared in Esquire, SPIN, Christianity Today, Time, The Wall Street Journal, and has been on everything from Fox News to Al Jazeera to CNN and NPR. And he's given lectures at Harvard, Princeton, Liberty, Duke, and Notre Dame. And he's actually going to be in our neck of the woods, Marina, this weekend. He is coming to Alberta, beautiful Alberta. And Shane, we are just so privileged to have you here today. And it's a blessing.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to being up there in Alberta with you soon.
Yeah. And you know, what really caught my eye, Shane, was when I saw you on a podcast and you had dreads, like, you know, down to your waist or something, but like that. Maybe it was a TED Talk. Were you on a TED Talk?
I don't know what you saw, but yeah, I had like 2 haircuts in about 20 years. So I've spent many years with long hair. I'm a little bit more kempt these days, but yeah, it's nice. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So you're coming to us from Philadelphia, and you were not always in Philadelphia. You grew up in Tennessee. So what was the journey that you took, Shane, to get you from a Tennessee boy uh, and to where you are now? You're quite the activist, and you speak for peace and love. So how did you get here?
Well, I love Tennessee where I grew up. There's many things that are still being redeemed and fought for in Tennessee. But I grew up in the um, kind of foothills of the Smoky Mountains, right where Dolly Parton grew up as well. That's our East Tennessee area. Uh, I fell in love with Jesus there. You know, it's the Bible Belt. It's often called the buckle of the Bible Belt. And and there were a lot of things that shaped and formed me there. I had a little bitty family. My dad died when I was pretty young, and so my mom and I are. I'm an only child, so mom and I are really, really tight. And I just, I wanted to experience the world outside of Tennessee. I was starting to have eyes to see, some of the racial divisions. I mean, it was still a very segregated state. It still is. I mean, just until recently, we had a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, in the capital of Tennessee. So it's a place that still has the electric chair and the death penalty. There's a lot of things that I started to question, and I took my faith very seriously. And so I came to Philadelphia because I heard of a little university here called Eastern, and it's a half hour outside of Philadelphia. I wanted to be near to a big city a little bit and meet folks that had different lived experiences than I did, looked different from me, ate different from me, thought different from me. And so I studied sociology and I studied the Bible because I like how Karl Barth said we need to read the Bible in one hand, but we always need to hold the newspaper in the other so that our faith doesn't just become a ticket into heaven and about escaping this world, but our faith should actually cause us to care about transforming this world and doing something about suffering and injustice. So while I was in undergrad, I first got involved in this neighborhood that I've called home for 25 years now. It's like quarter of a century. So I'll show you. I don't know if people are probably listening, but maybe some are watching. On the other side of the street, there's our community that we started 25 years ago. We've got murals and community gardens and all kinds of, affordable housing and helping kids with homework and doing a little bit of everything here. And it's so I've kind of got two homes. Still love Tennessee, but I'm really grown to feel right at home in Philly, and it's a beautiful neighborhood.
It's quite interesting. You were quite a young man. I think you were 19 when you went to India to work with Mother Teresa. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I guess you're right. It was back in I can remember it was the 1990s because we called India from a payphone, and it was in our college dorm. And when we, called India, it was about $3 a minute. So I was not looking to talk long, but I was trying to get a hold of one of the nuns that worked with Mother Teresa, and the phone rang, and we were calling, late at night, so that it would be the middle of the day in India. And Mother Teresa picked up the phone, and I said, we're trying to figure out how to follow Jesus. We'd love to come work with you for the summer. And she said, come on. And so we did. We worked, spent pretty much the whole summer there. And I had barely been out of the United States. So it was like totally new experience for me. And it shaped my spirituality. It shaped, I think, my heart and my desire to do something about poverty and injustice. And Mother Teresa was still alive, so she was in prayer almost every day. And I got to meet her and work in the homes that she started that I had read about. The Home for the Dying, that was Mother Teresa's first home that she started. That's where I worked every afternoon. I worked in the morning in the orphanages, and it became my job to every Tuesday to throw a street party for the kids. And so we'd get a bunch of the kids that were living on the street. I mean, a lot of them were 8 years old or 10 years old, 12 years old. And we'd throw this massive kind of street party for them. And so it was, there's just so many things that deepened for me. And, when you talk about hope and joy and all of those things, Mother Teresa, she, even though she wrestled with her faith, she didn't always feel, deeply connected to God, but she had this almost discipline of joy and hope. And I mean, everywhere you went in the homes, it would remind you to do small things with great love. That's what Mother Teresa said. You know, it's not how much you do, but it's how much love you put into doing it. So let's do small things with great love. And that's what we set out to do.
Yeah, in the book, this book that I just listened to, you talked about working with the leper population, right? The people with leprosy. And what was profound for me is when was it a doctor or a medic was changing bandages, and he asked you to take over and change bandages.
Yeah. It was a pretty unique experience because there was not a lot of folks that came in and out of Titigar, this little town where Mother Teresa had started a village, really. I mean, there was hundreds of families that lived there. And you know, in India, it still has, or really this is 20 some years ago, 25, 30, something, 27 years ago that, you know, we were there. And so there was still a lot of the caste system, you know, so like we think of the word outcast, but, you know, in that, the society there in India, I mean, folks couldn't go in shops, they couldn't go buy groceries or go in a restaurant. The kids couldn't go to regular schools if they had the skin diseases or leprosy. And so Mother Teresa said these folks are very, very special to God, and they're very oppressed in our culture. And so she started this village, and incidentally, it was named Gandhiji Prem Nivas, which means Gandhi's new life. And you know, Gandhi's idea was, let's create a new society in the shell of the old one. You know, we don't have to be dependent on all the structures that have oppressed us. And so we'll march to the sea and get our own salt. We'll spin our own clothes. You know, he's known for his homemade clothes. So in this village, they made their own clothes. They ran their own school. They had a fish hatchery. They had a wood shop, because there's a lot of amputation that happens with the disease. And so they would make a new arm or a leg. They custom made sandals to fit people's feet that might be, you know, affected differently by the disease. They made me a pair of sandals, you know, and so I just got to know these folks. And one of my jobs, I had several, but one of them was to roll cotton balls. So they had grown all this cotton and they're using it in the medical clinic. And interestingly enough, all of the doctors and the medics were folks that had leprosy, that had been treated, and now they were treating one another. But one of them had to leave early. And so he asked me, you know, could you take over? Because there's still a lot of patients that are coming. And so I had been there watching pretty, you know, intently. And so I did but I didn't speak any Hindi or Bengali, really. I mean, I picked up a few words here and there. So I sit down and I start nursing this guy's wound. And I don't really, you know, have much that I can say. And I'm, you know, whatever, 19 years old, and he's probably 60 or 70. And we're just looking in each other's eyes. And then he said this beautiful word that some of us may have heard, but it's hard to capture the depth of it. And he said, namaste. And one of the guys there said, do you know what that means? And I said, well, I'm familiar with it, but I'm not, you know, go ahead, tell me about it. And he said, it's hard to translate into English, but it's one of the most respectful, beautiful words that we have. And he said, it means essentially the Holy One who lives in me honors the Holy One who lives in you. And I genuinely just sat, you know, I had tears rolling down my face, and I sat staring into this guy's eyes. And I wrote in this new book that I felt like I wasn't just looking into the eyes of some poor leper in India, but I was looking into the eyes of Jesus. And I hoped, you know, especially as he said that maybe he didn't just see, you know, some young white kid from America, but maybe he was able to see a little bit of the image of God in me. And, you know, that encounter transcended words, and it really shaped a lot of how I hope I encounter people and look at people. You know, one of the things I I write about is that our faith, a lot of my faith growing up in the Bible Belt was about the doctrines and the beliefs of our faith. And I think those are important, but I've become really convinced that Christianity is not just about having new ideas, but about having new eyes and seeing people and seeing the world through with a certain sacredness and reverence that encounter kind of opened my own eyes to.
And how long have you been in Calcutta?
I was there for the summer, so like 10 weeks or so, and then I went back after Mother Teresa passed away for about a month with some other friends of mine, and it's been a place that really has impacted me. Even now, our community is called the Simple Way here in Philadelphia, and Mother Teresa wrote about the simple path, and she had a way of saying following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And the love, that we're aspiring to is a really it's a beautiful calling, but it's also daunting sometimes, and so it's the love that keeps us up at night when someone else is sleeping in the cold, or that makes us want to do something when our neighbor is suffering, because we recognize that could be us too.
I just returned from India in March, and I did the touristy thing. But what you talk about, in the dichotomy, like between the hotels and what's going on the outside hotels, it's heartbreaking. But then that beautiful custom they have to go namaste, and to see that the beauty in the people there was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's a very holy place. So, I love it. I hope to go back.
Shane, you moved to the north end of Philadelphia, right? And having never been to too many places in the United States, when you went in some of your podcasts or whatever that I listened to, you talked about northern Philadelphia. I mean, I'm from northern Alberta, Canada, so it's hard enough for me to just get to Edmonton. But tell us what it's like in northern Philadelphia, where you live, and why did you choose? You showed us a little screenshot of your view outside your window, but what's it like there? And you've made a home for yourself and your wife, your people that you work with. Why there?
Well, I in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like this neighborhood sort of chose me, because what happened when I was in undergrad, around the same time that I went to India, was there was a group of poor and homeless families in Philadelphia. These were mostly mothers and children that had nowhere to go, and there was a 10-year waiting list for affordable housing. There were over 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing, and they didn't have anywhere to go. And yet, on the north side of Philadelphia, our neighborhood has so many abandoned buildings. It's an old factory town, but we've lost like 100,000 jobs, and so there's 30,000 abandoned houses at the same time that there were 3,000 families, on a 10-year waiting list for housing. So things just didn't make sense. And these families did something really courageous. They found one of those abandoned buildings, but not just any abandoned building. It was an old Catholic cathedral, and they moved into it. And they started living there. There's about 100 people living there. Many of them were children and families. And what happened was that the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese in Philadelphia, gave them an eviction notice and said, if you're not out within 48 hours, you could be arrested for trespassing. And again, this building had been abandoned for years. And the family saw this not just as any space, but as a sanctuary with a rich tradition of being able to seek refuge in the church building. And so they put a banner on the front that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And they held a press conference, and they said, we mean no disrespect to the Catholic Church or the Catholic officials, but we've talk to the real owner of this building, the Lord. And God said that we can stay until we find housing. And so what happened was we heard about that, and it was catalytic. It really sparked a student movement, and many of us essentially moved in as much as we could alongside those families. And that lasted for months, and many of them got housing. A lot of them are still dear friends. The kids that were born in that church are, 25 years old now. And so it's just an incredible experience. And that's how I got involved in this neighborhood. So over the years, we've been trying to, as we say, build a neighborhood that we're proud to call home. And we have a lot of theology of place, thinking about the place that we live and what it means to live missionally, seeking God's dream on earth as it is in heaven. What is God's dream for our block? And there's a lot of stigma attached to Kensington. In Philadelphia, folks refer to our neighborhood often as the Badlands, but I always correct them. And I say, that's exactly what they said of Nazareth. Nothing good could come from there. That's exactly what people said. And yet that's where God showed up. And so I think for me, the whole story of Jesus is about God leaving the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth, and not just coming in any human body, but coming marginalized as a poor, dark-skinned Palestinian, Jewish baby refugee born in the middle of a genocide as Herod was massacring the children in throughout the land. I mean, this is all about God's solidarity with us from birth to the cross, as we just remembered at Easter. So, I think that much of the gravity in our world tries to pull us away from neighborhoods like mine, neighborhoods where there's still some struggles. But I think the gravity of the gospel takes us towards the suffering of the world. And so there's a lot of things that we do to try to have defiant hope, in situations that can feel pretty desperate. Right now we're losing over 1,000 lives every year to opioids. And many of those are right in Kensington. We have encampments all everywhere. And so we wanted to really expose the urgency of the human lives are at stake. And this happened in the winter when there was snow on the ground and the kids were going to have a snowball fight. And one of them said, "We're worried when we, ball up the snow that we're going to find needles underneath the snow, heroin needles." And we said, this is messed up, and so we had a whole campaign called Need a Little Help. And we put the needles in jars and epoxy, and we put quotes from the kids, and we delivered these. We did a press conference, and the kids took these to our mayor, our police commissioner, our health commissioner, like all the city council folks. And we said, this is not okay. I mean, this is a public health crisis. So, Dr. Martin Luther King, who's a great inspiration of mine too, along with Mother Teresa, he said, we have to expose injustice so that it becomes so uncomfortable that people have to do something. And that's what we're trying to do, around gun violence and the opioids. So much of what we do is about this place. It's about seeking the kingdom of God, as Jesus said, on earth, but even more particularly in Kensington, on our block, in our neighborhood. What is God's dream for our neighborhood? That's what we're asking every day.
It reminds me a lot to go back to India, the lesson about the lotus flower, where the lotus would grow in the filthiest of water to produce this beautiful, pure flower. And I think that's in a very big way exactly what you do. You go into places where a lot of people today would not set foot, and you create a lot of beauty and a lot of love and a lot of.
Well, I want to be real clear that I think I love my neighborhood. I really do. And, some folks might find that hard to love, but the longer I've been here, the more I've become convinced that neighborhoods that are economically poor are often community rich. I mean, it's how people have survived. There's such resilience and creativity and a deep, resilient faith here. And I mean, I learn new stories of that all the time. But, you know, a few years ago, one of the abandoned factories burnt our entire block down. It burned our community center down. It was owned by the city of Philadelphia, burned our whole block down because of the neglect of the city. And yet our neighborhood rebuilt that whole block. The Red Cross set up a shelter because 100 families were displaced. It's one of the biggest fires in our neighborhood's history. And the Red Cross said nobody stayed in the shelter because everybody in your neighborhood opened up their homes to each other. And we rebuilt that whole block, and we're opening a new community center in 2 weeks that our friends have built there, with a gym and a cafe, and it's called Phoenix Cafe because it rose out of the ashes, you know. So I really do. I love my neighborhood, and I think there's a lot of neighborhoods that are economically rich that are community poor. They're culturally poor. And so, you know, my friend Derek Webb wrote a beautiful song. He's a songwriter, and he wrote a song that has a line. It essentially says, "God's been good. I've finally been able to move out of Jesus's neighborhood." And he kind of points out the irony that a lot of folks are good at moving out of the places that God would be moving into. So I really am grateful that my neighborhood has welcomed me and taught me so much about hope and faith and believing despite the evidence. You know, I see it all the time.
You know, you've done a lot of work with prisoners on death row. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I'm afraid. I would be afraid to do that. I mean, maybe it's because there's a stigma, and I know, because I was born and raised a Catholic person. So I teach in a Catholic school. I know that Jesus says to go to the jails, go to the homeless, go to the marginalized, go, you know, and yet I'm afraid. So Shane, you go into prisons, big prisons, and you sit with and you talk with, and even like the week before a prisoner is put to death, you're with them. And you know, I know that's God within that gives you the inspiration and the courage and motivation. But tell us a little bit about that, because it needs to be talked about. It needs to be, because you must not be the only human being that does that, the only Christian that hangs out or just is present for people on death row.
Well, I think that we're often uncomfortable, no matter who we are. We're most uncomfortable in settings that are unfamiliar or with people who are different from us. And I think for me, when I first went into some of the criminal justice institutions and the jails, like, it was very, I mean, it's created to install fear and all of this to dehumanize people. And yet, the more I visited, the more I realized that every person that I'm encountering has the same, like, love and brokenness inside of them that I have. I'll tell you about my first experience one of my first experiences going to Tennessee's death row, where I've been able to visit for about 10 years or so now. And I was speaking at a conference, but I was excited to dip out and to go visit Riverbend's Unit 2, which is where death row is in Tennessee. And the governor was also speaking at this conference. So I was kind of hoping to bump into him, because Tennessee had not had many executions at the time, and he was facing the decision of whether or not to restart executions. And I knew that he was a Christian, and so I did just beautifully. I would say that the Spirit, lined up this encounter. I bumped into him on the way out, and I said a famous. The only thing that came to mind was a famous line of Mother Teresa when she called a governor right before an execution and said, "Do what Jesus would have you do." So I said, Governor, I'm praying that you will do what Jesus would have you do. The one who said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." And I had a lovely encounter with him, and sadly he did begin to execute folks. And so I kept praying for him. But then I went to death row. So listen to this. When I went in, I walk in, and I'm able to sit down with like 10 guys, and we had, a couple hours together. They're not in shackles or chains or anything. We're able to sit around. And I said to them, I just bumped into the governor. What would you say? I threw the question to them. If you bumped into Governor Haslam, what would you say? And listen to what they said. It was quiet. And then all of a sudden, one of them, his name's Kevin. He said, "I'd say to the governor, would you come pray with us and listen to the stories of what Jesus has done in our lives?"
Mm-hmm.
And they all just like resound with it, resounding agreement, said, "Yes, we'd invite the governor to come pray with us." So now they've actually made that an official request. And over half of the guys on Tennessee's death row have asked, it's now a new governor, Governor Lee, to come visit them and pray with them and hear the stories of what God's done. And check this out. Kevin that said that, this is years later, he felt the call to ministry, and he's still living on death row. And he got ordained, and I got to be there. And I mean, over the years, my wife has been, my mom's been, I've been able to bring a bunch of my friends, and so I got to be there for his ordination, and he's being ordained. He shares his entire testimony of how he came to know Jesus, and what's happened in his life. And then his first act of ordination was to service all communion on death row. And I mean, it's one of the most powerful experiences in my life. And I think it deepened my understanding of the Eucharist, or of communion, right? Of this, I mean, the fact that I'm being served communion, remembering the executed and risen Christ by a man who's currently condemned to die and could be executed. So, I mean, it just raises so many important questions. And I believe if the governor, if the prison, if the folks that carry out the execution, if they were able to be in that room, of Tennessee legislators who go to church every Sunday were there listening to the testimonies, praying with these men, it would change them. So I really believe that proximity makes all the difference in the world. It's why Jesus said, "When I was in prison, did you visit me?" And so I believe that. But it's not just for them that I visit, but it's because I've experienced profound faith, the reality of what Christ can do, and I've seen that over and over. I tell some of those stories, in this new book. And I know people who I believe are innocent. I know are innocent. Some of them are out now because they proved their innocence. I know other folks, like my friend Don Johnson, who he was guilty. I mean, he did something terrible, and it makes me sick at my stomach. And the thing is, I think it made him sick too. And he became a deeply committed Christian, tried to heal the wounds of what he did. And I was there right before his execution. We prayed together. He fasted. He actually forfeited his final meal and asked that the money be donated to a local charity to feed the homeless. And he died singing worship songs. He asked if he could sing, and he sang, "Soon and very soon, I'm going to see the King. There's no more dying there. There's no more crying there. I'm going to see the King." So those experiences have changed me, but they've also put a fire in my bones to create alternatives to the death penalty. And I know you all are, ahead of us in that realm in Canada, but there's always folks that kind of want to go back rather than go forward, or that believe that, for me, that this raises some of the most fundamental questions of our faith. Is anybody beyond redemption? Let the one who's without sin cast the first stone. And so don't we believe that we're all more than the worst thing that we've ever done, and that God's grace should have some word in all of it? So yeah, I know that was a big answer to your question, but it's certainly it's so important to me. And I've got, all around me things that remind me of the stories, some of men that I still visit and write with, and others, like I've got this origami butterfly that was given to me by John Ramirez, and he was executed recently in Texas. But right before he was executed, I was talking with him, and I said, what can I do? We were supporting his family. I said, could I send you some prayer books? I thought he might want some spiritual resources. And he was a really funny guy. He goes, I got enough prayer books and I love them, but I'm trying to learn origami. Would you send me an origami book? And I mean, like 4 weeks from his execution, he's learning origami. And I think it's just so beautiful and so human. So he sent me this butterfly, as a one of his last things that he gave me, and I hold it right here on my desk.
Incredible.
It's me again of hope, right? There's really hope until that last breath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, there's so many stories, I think, of that. And I think if we are people of faith and people of hope, we've got to, like that old image of shine in the darkness, we've got to be near to the pain of the world, I think, to if we're going to be light, and if we're going to share love. And one of the guys I visited before he was executed, James Coddington in Oklahoma, he had not had a visitor in 12 years, other than his legal counsel. No visitors. In fact, even when I visited him, we had plexiglass between us, so it wasn't a contact visit, but we were able to put our hands, on the plexiglass and pray. I was able to pray for him. I read him from the book of Romans that nothing can separate us from the love of God. I said, not even this plexiglass, not even the death chamber. Like, God's love is bigger than this filthy, rotten system that you're stuck in. So don't let it fool you. You're a child of God, and I prayed that he would know that same whisper we all need to know, that we are deeply loved by God. And he had one of the most difficult lives I've ever heard of. And he committed a murder. He killed one of his friends, and he said, every single day, I regret it. And he says, I know what I did. I relive it every single day. And he said, I've done everything I know to try to heal the harm that I did. So I think that's where you would think, like, anyone who professes to follow the Prince of Peace, right? We should bear witness of love and mercy and redemption in those places and those moments. So so it's so important.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the work you've done with gun violence. Like, you talked about the needles, collecting the needles out of the snow, but there's a profound story you have as well about the Northern Philadelphia gun violence, and what you and I guess it's your people, did to help with that.
Yeah, I was looking for a couple little things on my desk. I'm embarrassed by how messy my desk is here. So good thing you can't see it. But yeah, I mean, what happened with gun violence? I grew up with guns. I grew up hunting with my grandfather. Most of my family still own guns, but many of them are also deeply concerned about the unimaginable and very preventable epidemic of gun violence in our country. Just recently, during COVID, we hit the highest gun deaths that we have in modern history. Gun violence became the #1 cause of death of American children. It's bigger than cancer or car accidents. And and we're losing. I wrote a book about guns called Beating Guns, but we've had to update the statistic. When I wrote that book, it was 100 lives a day being lost to guns. Now it's 120 lives a day in America being lost to guns. I mean, it's just nowhere else among our peer nations does that exist. I mean, we've got but what, I think people like debate it and talk about it, but when it becomes close to home, it makes a big difference. And living in North Philadelphia, we've just seen too many lives cut short. And one of those was a 19-year-old that was shot in front of our house. And I'll never forget, I held his hand. He was hit by the bullets, and the ambulance came and they took him, and he passed away the next day. And that was the moment for me where, in the words of Dr. King, he said, we're all called to be the good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, maybe we need to do something about the whole road to Jericho. And for me, when Papito died, that was when I really began to organize around gun violence. But I felt like we needed imagination. We needed hope, right? And I like to say this is our language, is we say we're not just protesting, but we're protestifying, right? We're proclaiming that things can be different. And so what we started to do is to, inspired by Micah and Isaiah, the biblical prophets that talk about beating swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks, literally transforming metal that's been crafted to kill into metal that's been, that's meant to cultivate life. And so we started transforming guns, and we get guns donated and surrendered all the time. We've had a dozen or so this week, and we chop them up and decommission them legally and safely. We've been trained to do all that, but then we transform them. And I don't know if everyone listening can see, but this is one of our plows that I'm showing on the screen. And this is all made out of a gun. So the barrel and the handle is wood, but we turn the wood from the wood stock of the gun. So sometimes I tell my evangelical friends, this is what a gun looks like when it gets born again. and we're proclaiming, all things can be made new. We're melting bullets that we found. We find bullet casings on our block all the time. And so we have a little waste bucket that people can put the casings from bullets if they find them on our street, and we melt them down. And these hearts that we make are, brass hearts made from bullet casings. So all of that to me it's about doing something, but also we do these public demonstrations where people share their stories, and this becomes very personal. It's a way of centering the human lives that have been impacted by gun violence, and saying, just as metal can be transformed, so can our country, so can our policies. It doesn't have to be this way. So it's part of what we do.
Well, Shane, this was fantastic, and we're running out of time here. I know that you are in a hurry to leave us tonight, because you are.
Oh, I'm not in a hurry, but I'm going to be up there soon. I hope to see you, but yeah, I don't want to cut it short. But it's been wonderful.
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
We will have to get you back, because this is captivating, and good job on keeping people accountable, and such amazing causes that you fight for, harder than anybody I think I've personally ever met. So thank you for being that voice and that example of what I think a lot of people miss in today's world. So lastly, if you could tell people how they get hold of you or of your book, how can they support you, how can they get involved, that would be lovely.
Yeah, well, folks can you can follow me. I'm pretty active on social media. So I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. It's just my name, Shane Claiborne. But we also are really building a movement. As Fran said, Red Letter Christians, we get our name from the Bibles that have the words of Jesus and the gospel highlighted in red. And so we call ourselves Red Letter Christians. So people can go there, redletterchristians.org, and keep in touch, see what we're doing, see how you can be a part of it. I think a lot of people, maybe even folks that have become a little disenchanted with some of the things that they've seen in Christianity or the church, or looking for some new life-giving spiritual spaces. So check out redletterchristians.org. And as far as books, you can get them everywhere, but you can also get them right off of our website at Red Letter Christians or my community, The Simple Way. And we then use all the money to kind of support this work in our neighborhood and the work we're doing for Jesus and justice.
Mhm. Mhm. And you know, Shane, one last thing is thanks for giving Christians a good name.
Well,
Because
we're all trying to live out a beautiful version of our faith, you know. And I think if you go to a bad concert, you don't necessarily give up on music, but you want to hear some better music.
better
So,
music.
you know,
Yeah.
Richard Rohr, who's a dear friend, he's we've done so much together, and Richard always says the best critique of what's wrong is the practice of something better. So if we've seen a version of Christianity that's not too beautiful, then let's try to live out a more beautiful version and do that in the most humble way that we can, you know. So yeah.
I agree.
Well,
Well,
bless you all.
so much, and namaste.
Namaste.
Thanks for being here.
Bless you. See you in Edmonton.